To the World Built Environment Forum webinar series. Nowadays, rarely if ever is the business case for a new infrastructure project approved solely on economic grounds. Instead, projects need to demonstrate the social value they promise to generate over the entire life cycle of the assets they create. In the case of infrastructure, this might mean the impact they have on the environment, cultural heritage, on housing, mental and physical health, or crime and safety, to name just a few. The COVID-19 pandemic has given new impetus and prominence to thinking about inclusive growth linked to social value. My name is John Krause, and today we're discussing how to measure and demonstrate the social value of infrastructure. Over the next hour, we'll be looking at what we mean by social value in the context of infrastructure, what do we measure to assess the social impact, and how do we measure it. We'll also be taking a look at the role of standards in this field. So let's meet our experts. Firstly, Sophia Cox, Sustainability Advisor of the UK Green Building Council. Welcome to you, Sophia.
Hi, John. Great to be here.
And also joining us today is Dr. Daniel Fujiwara, Chief Executive Officer at Symmetrica Jacobs. Hello to you, Daniel.
Hi, John. Thank you. I look forward to the webinar.
Thank you both. Now, to everybody listening in, we always welcome your active involvement, so do please submit questions to our experts. It really helps to keep the conversation going. And if you're new to these webinars, you should see that you can submit questions at any time using the question box on your screen. And we'll pick up as many as we can as we go through the session. So to get us started, then, the first topic we've got is defining social value. And social value refers to all the impacts that an intervention, policy or project has on society and the value that these impacts have, whether they're positive or sometimes negative. Now, Sophia, I mentioned some of these in my introductory remarks. In your opinion, what is social value in the context of infrastructure?
Thanks, John. It's a great question, and it's something that at UKGBC we're tackling at the moment, albeit in sort of the slightly wider context of the entire built environment. We have a task group which is looking at creating a definition of social value for the built environment sector. And halfway through, I can tell you it is not as straightforward as you would think. There are some areas which are, perhaps less controversial. So the fact that social value is something that should be understood quite holistically. It can mirror the 3 pillars of sustainability, being reflecting environmental, economic and social factors, as long as the lens and the kind of ultimate ambition is about quality of life. One of the things that we found really powerful for our members is that there are opportunities for delivering social value right across the life cycle of an asset, so from investment, design, construction, and through to operation. And then thirdly, that it's something that looks very, very different in different contexts, and that it's so dependent on what the local need is, what the specific project type is, the stage of the development life cycle, who's delivering, what they're capable of delivering. And I think that's something that's even trickier for infrastructure projects, because the community or the beneficiaries are perhaps less well defined. But it is starting with that local need, which is the key, I think, to understanding what it looks like for an infrastructure project.
Thank you. So some interesting points there about the 3 pillars of sustainability: economic, social, environmental, that you mentioned, and this quality of life lens that can be applied, and the importance of context in considering this. You mentioned that community, the beneficiaries, if you like, were hard to define. Could you say a little bit more about how you would define or group the beneficiaries?
Sure, and I think it's something that's not resolved. It's very much a live debate. We sometimes talk about the primary beneficiary being the local community for a built asset. So those would be the people who have some form of interaction with that building or place, either as a resident or because they work there or because thinking maybe a bit wider because they're just a resident of the city that has that particular building or place. However, some of the things that we measure under social value go even wider than that, the broader societal benefits of that place as a country, as a citizen of the UK, or when we're looking at carbon factors as a kind of citizen of the world. Or if we're looking down the supply chain, the people who are involved in the very long supply chains of the construction industry. So where we draw that line, I think, is varied at the moment. I think instinctively there should become some kind of needs basis for where we do draw the line. But yeah, as I said before, very much a live debate.
Thank you. So very clear message there that when we're saying what is social value in terms of infrastructure, the question that really does need to be answered as part of that is who are we talking about as the beneficiaries? Daniel, just listening to Sophia's remarks there, how would you reflect on how we define social value?
Thank you. Yeah, I think all of the points that Sophia made were really great and kind of exactly in line with how we think about social value in an academic perspective and in terms of how government is delivering it and defining it. There are, on paper, it's quite an easy thing to define because we're talking about, we can just say it's about quality of life and well-being and how we improve that for society. But when we start to dig deeper, we start to see there's lots of issues. So how actually do we define quality of life, right? So it's a very kind of intangible concept, and it's something I'll touch on in my part a bit later. And once we've got there, what outcomes, and as Sophia was saying, what stakeholders would we include? It's a very difficult choice. So I think whilst there's a strong definition, there's still quite a lot to do around a core set of metrics and those stakeholders, but really we should be always thinking about who is impacted on. That can be any range of stakeholders. That can be kind of wildlife and the environment, as well as businesses and individuals, keeping all of those different stakeholders in mind. And I think also it's very important to always remember that there are likely to be negative impacts as well, because we see a lot of studies that really focus only on the positive side, but for every road that you're building or stadium or shopping center or whatever the piece of infrastructure is, there's likely to be adverse environmental effects, or you're having to knock down a school or build it in a bit of green space. So that element as well is something that we really do need to keep a tab on.
Thank you. So what's coming through there is a message really about balancing, and there's obviously a very important need to somehow weight all the different considerations and see how they add up overall. Let's move on to our second question, which certainly builds on this point. So we've identified some key areas of social value that infrastructure can deliver. But Daniel, that means we need to have something by way of a set of metrics. So the question for you is what are we actually measuring?
Yeah, so there are two levels there, and I think we the first level, if we take one step back and go back to kind of what Sophia was initially commenting on around welfare, there is that question of ultimately what is it that we want to measure? What is it that we want to promote or maximize when we measure social value? And that's not a question about metrics, that's a more fundamental ethical question. And we've already kind of touched on that, but that is ultimately this notion of well-being or quality of life in its very broadest sense. And what we mean by that is how people's lives are going, whether they're improving or whether they're being impacted on negatively. And this is an issue known as welfarism. It's about welfare, well-being, and that being the ultimate aim. And then when we take that into account, we can start to see that there are then a set of metrics and outcomes that are instrumental for well-being. So within social value, the interesting kind of definition or categories we have is we have something that is of intrinsic value to society, and that is people's well-being and quality of life. That just matters because it matters. There's no further rationale or reasoning we need to give for that. And then beneath that, we have a set of what we call instrumental outcomes, and those are outcomes that are important because they impact on well-being. And that's where we can start to think about the role of infrastructure, and different sectors will differ in terms of their instrumental outcomes. So when we think about instrumental outcomes, they are really anything and everything that impact on well-being positively and negatively. So you've already touched on, John, a few of the items, things like physical health, which might be improved if we have better cycleways, better pathways, etc. Sustained employment and education and skills through the supply chain, and also things like reduced crime. There are some other areas that we've looked at quite a lot in our different infrastructure projects, things like community pride, social cohesion, social capital is quite a large one that we've looked at. We looked at the impact on social capital and social pride, for example, in a recent study we've done for Everton Football Club for their stadium, and whether that bit of infrastructure can build social capital, and lots of things like access to housing, access to services and leisure facilities are a big one. And also you could get the negative of that, which is land severance and kind of reducing that access. And another big one we deal with a lot when we talk about museums and things like that is aesthetic value. So the aesthetic value of the building externally or internally, and also things like green space and public space. So those are the types of things that we want to measure at the ground level, but ultimately we want to think about how that impacts on people's quality of life. And just a note on a couple of things on that, and this is, I think most of the audience will be aware of the publication we launched yesterday around measuring social value in infrastructure with RICS, but this is an area that we get into quite a lot in that insights paper, which is actually, once we've measured things like, you know, changes in crime rates or changes in pollution and things like that, how do we actually think of that in terms of quality of life? And the two options we broadly have is around either looking at people's preferences, so you know, how strongly do they want that thing, and where we assume that preferences is a gauge of how much people need that thing in their life, and hence how important it is for their quality of life. Or we can look at people's self-reported levels of well-being, so how happy people feel, how satisfied people feel with their lives, and whether those outcomes are impacting on it. So it's quite a big jigsawing of different issues, if that makes sense. We have to set out a series of outcomes, or almost kind of KPIs, things like crime and environment and skills and jobs. And then the next stage is to look at how that impacts on people's preferences or on how they report their quality of life.
Thank you. It's a very full answer, and I can see many different aspects. So we might come back to some of those points again in a moment. Just a reminder to everybody listening, you can submit questions and we'll put them to the panel. Sophia, perhaps I can ask you to respond to some of that. From your point of view, what is it that UK GBC would be looked to measuring?
Well, I think one of the most important things for us, and one of the things that we try to impress on our members, is if you sort of consider the sliding scale from measuring inputs to outputs to outcomes, to try and focus on the outcomes, the ultimate impact, as much as possible. That is obviously the stuff that's harder to measure, and it's not always possible, but that is the way that we can ensure that the activities that are being invested in, you know, for no small cost, are actually being effective. And I think one of the problems at the moment for the built environment sector is that there's a lot of kind of tick boxing of inputs, say number of apprenticeships on construction sites, but not necessarily as enough or as much focus on those ultimate well-being, quality of life outcomes.
Thank you. So that's, would you like to expand on that? You sort of talk about tick boxing, number of apprenticeships. What else would be an example of a sort of tick box approach?
I think there are, because of the way that the requirements for social value are set up through procurement, they can be quite ham-handed in terms of the local authority not necessarily, or other public sector body, not necessarily thinking I guess, creatively or intelligently enough about what the best focus for social value should be. And then that is kind of leading to a situation where people are not necessarily delivering in the needs of the local community. They're not necessarily delivering stuff which matches what they're best at, what they as an organisation are really good at delivering. But if you focus on an outcome, if the local authority or the public sector has asked for a specific outcome, it's then up to the organisation to innovate and use the best tools at their disposal and in the local context to deliver that outcome. And that's a more sophisticated approach.
Thank you. So let's move on then, because I think once we've we've captured these ideas of what it is we're trying to measure, then we're getting into the how we do it. So our next topic is precisely that. How do we measure the metrics? How do we assess them? And Daniel, that's very much your field. So in your approach, or the approaches you're seeing in industry, how do we go about measuring the social value, capturing the metrics that we've just been referring to?
So we typically do a lot of work at kind of the project inception stage, which is probably two layers really there. It's first of all thinking through who the stakeholders are. So is it a certain community? Is it businesses? Is it the exchequer and taxpayer, for example? And then starting to map out the different outcomes and which stakeholder they're relevant to. So if people are familiar with something, like a theory of change model or a logic model, where you've got, an intervention, and as Sophia was saying, you've got kind of inputs, outputs, and then ultimately the outcomes, and mapping that onto different stakeholders is typically where we start. And we will look at a very broad range of indicators and start to narrow those down. So, projects will typically have things like employment outcomes. They'll have some type of impact on the environment, so they would be very standard in the type of thing that we do. But when we start to push that further, is there an impact on industrial or natural heritage or cultural heritage, for example? Is there an impact on noise levels that we need to pick up? Are there impacts on education for children and health? So we would start to expand it that way. And we typically try and collect some longitudinal data on these metrics for these large projects. So at inception stage, when the project is still not launched, we will do some predictive analysis about the types of outcomes, and we may use other similar projects that have happened in the UK or globally, for example, to build a statistical model to then try and make some predictions about the outcomes, and then you should be evaluating that through the construction phase and then the operational phase to ensure, or to just double check whether those outcomes are being delivered. And one of the major issues we have about measuring the outcomes, and it's absolutely correct what Sophia said, that we need to move away from this viewpoint of inputs and really get to the outcomes, because that's what we're delivering. But when we look at everything through an outcomes lens, there is an issue around causality or additionality, effectively both referring to the same thing, which is we may observe an improvement in employment rates or CO2 emissions or levels of air pollution, that type of thing. But how do we really know that that was due to our particular project? And that's where it starts to get complex. We're having to look at what would have happened anyway, this kind of idea of a counterfactual. Do we get that counterfactual from another region? So you're building a bridge, for example, in one area of the UK, where we are predicting to see higher rates of economic growth and connectivity because of that? Do we compare that to a similar area without that type of infrastructure in place? How do we do that? So there's a range of statistical methods we then have to start to think through once we've determined a set of outcomes, to try and understand whether those things would have happened anyway. So just to give you an example, if we're looking at employment rates and we're predicting that a particular infrastructure project is going to generate 300 jobs, well, maybe some of those jobs would have been generated anyway. Those people may have found those jobs elsewhere. Are you in fact actually just pulling jobs from Middlesbrough to Newcastle, for example, so there's no net benefit in that particular region in the northeast, as an example? And would these jobs have been created anyway due to increasing economic growth, for example? So those are the types of challenges we have to face and have to deal with when we really get knee deep into kind of the outcomes measurement side. And the last thing I would just pick up on is this issue of double counting, which I come across a lot. So, you know, we've seen projects that are claiming, for example, health benefits of getting into work as well as the benefits of work. But actually, when you look into the values that are being used, the value for employment is already capturing the health benefit. So you're ending up kind of double counting those. And that's another big area that we have to really be aware of, because it will just kind of inflate the values if you're double counting these different types of issues.
So with all those challenges there, what are the kind of models that you would then apply? Because I mean, everyone's heard of cost benefit analysis, for example. There are other models, perhaps less well known and less widely used. What are the models that you think are particularly useful in solving these challenges?
Yeah, so there are a couple of, I guess, layers there again. So you've mentioned cost benefit analysis, and if I just revert back to the best practice guidelines that we have in the UK at the moment. So the Treasury releases what's known as the Green Book every 6 or 7 years, and the most recent version was in 2018. The Green Book has always been the manual in the UK for social value measurement. It's the core guidance in the UK government. All kind of, you know, main UK government departments have to use that guideline, that set of guidelines to measure social value. And at the core of that is cost benefit analysis, which is effectively saying measure the outcomes, value those outcomes, both positive and negative, in monetary terms, you know, and that includes both kind of, you know, financial as well as more intangible benefits like improvements in education or improvements in health, and compare those back to the costs. And if the benefits outweigh the costs, then that would tell you that this particular program is generating social value. But alongside that, there are some other methods that we have in place. So there's a method known as cost effectiveness analysis that effectively looks at one success measure of a program and assesses the amount of investment required to generate one additional outcome. So how much does it cost to reduce fatalities by 1 over the course of a year, for example, through the improvement in the motorway infrastructure, as one particular example. So you'd be looking at how many pounds it costs to generate that, say, you know, that reduction in a single fatality, rather than looking at trying to monetize or value the fatalities. And you're going to be then taking the project that has the lowest cost for that success outcome. And there's a very similar version of that called cost utility analysis within health, which looks specifically at health outcomes, and something known as the quality adjusted life year. So how much does it cost to improve people's health related quality of life by a single metric? So those are 2 or 3 of the core methods that sit in the Green Book. You can also refer to the OECD guidelines that really do mirror the Green Book. And we've got, you know, if you think more globally, in places like New Zealand, Australia, the US, there are separate guidance manuals in those countries that all really mirror what's happening in the OECD. And also, you know, you've got places like the WHO and the UN that have similar guidelines. So those are some of the metrics. And within that, there are a series of ways of measuring cause and effect, as it were. So, you know, when your cost benefit analysis will just tell you that you need to measure the outcomes and then value those outcomes, it's quite silent on how those outcomes should be measured. So that's when kind of the field of statistics comes in, and it's suggesting that you should be looking at a counterfactual, you should be looking at a control group or a control region to assess whether what you're doing has really had an impact. And the last thing I could just say on here is that there are a growing number of other methods out there as well. So there are methods, for example, like multi-criteria analysis, which is kind of a scoring and weighting method of outcomes, and more recently social return on investment and social accounting are further areas. I think those latter approaches are fine for application in kind of things like the charity sector, non-profit sector. That's where they're designed to be used, but they do struggle quite a bit when we get into major infrastructure schemes or government policies where it becomes very technical. and hence they're not currently included in things like the Green Book.
And I think it's right to say that all those methods are covered in the report that you've just published with RICS. I think that's the case, is it not?
Yes, so we go into a lot of depth about the fundamental kind of theory behind the methods, and then the application, the pros and cons of each method, and then I think we've got 5 or 6 case studies that use the different methods to demonstrate social value.
Thank you, and we'll publish the links to that report as 1 or 2 people online are asking us. So when we publish the recording of this webinar and the write-up, there will be the links to that report. Sophia, perhaps I can bring you back in at this stage, and specifically I've got a question from one of our listeners, Charlie Hopkirk, who's asking about the impact of the Social Value Act in the UK, and he's asking, do you think the Social Value Act limits the ability to embed social outcomes and well-being into infrastructure projects? Is that something the UK GBC has looked at?
Not specifically. I mean, I can speak to kind of the Social Value Act and its impact kind of on the sector as seen by us through our members, which has been, I guess, quite an interesting, I hate the word journey, but I suppose journey is appropriate here. Obviously, it was, it's the 2012 Act. It came into force in January 2013. Response to it was sluggish, to say the least. Things have obviously picked up a pace. It was reinvigorated in 2018 with David Lidington's speech, which announced the intention of central government to strengthen the use of the Act across central government contracts, which was sort of swiftly followed by the strategy for civil society, which reinforced the same intention, along with an idea to look at social value within the context of planning and grant making. Then swiftly followed by the consultation, social value and procurement, which ran last June, and we were supposed to hear results of in last September, and we're still sort of waiting on those. So it's a little bit less clear what social value will look like from a sort of Social Value Act driven perspective. It is likely to be some sort of measurement framework. I think, to answer the question, the worry is that if that measurement framework, which would be used across all central government contracts, is too tick boxy, doesn't understand sort of some of the nuances of the topic, that's where it will have a limiting factor, and that's where we might see kind of issues that have played out perhaps more often in local authority procurement being more widespread. I mean, I think the solution to that is a recognition of social value delivery as a process-driven exercise, and it's more about engaging stakeholders, involving community, understanding needs, being really bespoke to, sort of said it again and again, the particular instance, and that will be a good remedy rather than being prescriptive about a set of outcomes or interventions.
Thank you, and I think this is leading us nicely into the idea of standards, so which is our next topic. And I mean, there's a mantra, isn't there, here at business schools, that in order to deliver the priority outcomes, the main thing is to make sure the main thing remains the main thing. So in the case of infrastructure, one might assume that the main thing could be, for example, to deliver on a core outcome, such as, or output, I suppose, such as additional transport capacity. So you build your bridge, and it's wider, traffic can flow through it in greater volumes more quickly, whatever. And in that respect, delivering that seems to be the main focus. The social value might seem a secondary or even dispensable benefit, especially if costs and time are overrunning. So Sophia, in this case, how do we maintain the focus on social value? And if so, what standards are needed?
Well, I mean, to your point about what is sort of material in a particular instance, it's actually in the wording of the Social Value Act that social value delivered should be relevant to the project. And another one of the kind of problems out there is that quite often the social value that people are committing to through bids, through planning conditions, so through planning submissions, is ancillary, or even worse, completely irrelevant to the particular community and the thing that is being built, which is a huge problem. I think, and also it's a kind of waste of people's resources. If you have an organization that's good at delivering something, get them to deliver that to the best of their ability, rather than getting them to run a program for in something that they have less experience in. So I think that's really important. To the question around standards, I mean, again, I'll kind of reflect on what I consider to be a real world problem for the built environment sector. And it's fairly anecdotal, but quite a lot of the organisations that we work with, who we consider to be ones that are very good at delivering social value, and quite often I think in this isn't just limiting to this, but for the built environment, it is things like exceptional design that lasts in the long term, and is there sort of in perpetuity for the benefit of the local community and wider society. Those organisations are struggling to win work off the basis of their social value, and that's because there's a lack of understanding between both parties. That no one is articulating it in the same way, and there also isn't necessarily a standard of delivery articulated. So we definitely feel like there's a missed opportunity in terms of, as I said before, articulating a really high standard of process and principles for delivering social value. And I think that could really help to resolve that issue where people are just not talking in the same language. And that's one of the things our definition of the built environment sector is aiming to do.
And in terms of that, I just want to pick up on a question that's come in from Richard Hosking, who's making the point that some of the outcomes that you would get from an infrastructure project, let's say it's volumes of traffic passing across a bridge, you can measure them in very standard economic terms. There's just a number, and you can compare the percentage change. Whereas the social outcomes can be rather more subjective, and the scale that they're on may be more of a relative than an absolute scale. So how do you approach that? Is there a way of saying that a social value aspect of this piece of infrastructure scores a number on a scale of 1 to 10? Is that possible? Do you do that?
I don't know. Daniel might have a better insight on that.
So Daniel, what would you say?
So yeah, I mean, some of these indicators are very intangible, but others do have some more quantitative metrics around them. So if you take noise as a good example of the latter, which we know that frequent and kind of random patterns in noise from transport and traffic has a detrimental effect on kids' performance, on people's mental health and well-being, and we can measure that through noise contours and sound receptors and things like that at the decibel level, and it's something that's fairly standardized now. The whole area, or the approach around, for example, cost benefit analysis, which is the core method, is that all of those indicators that are intangible, that there are methods out there, and we discussed these in the paper. There are 5 or 6 different methods that allow you to quantify and value those outcomes, and by doing so, it allows us to put an impact, like impact on heritage or negative impacts of noise, or loss of biodiversity or improvements in people's physical health on a quantitative scale that then can be compared back to financial indicators. So if you've got a multiplier effect or improvements in local economic growth rates that you're predicting from a piece of infrastructure in financial terms, you can add to that these other more intangible benefits, so long as you've followed that type of, the best practice methods of getting there, because you will have quantified them and valued them in a way that allows you to compare, £1 million worth of, let's say, health benefits. You can add those to £2 million worth of economic benefits to have, £3 million in total of social value. So that's kind of where these methods are going. It allows you to quantify them, and we're usually doing that in a monetary scale, although there are some methods that would allow you to put it on a scale of 0 to 100, for example.
I suppose that there's also a question about timescale, because £1 million of health benefits, over what time? Clearly that's delivered year on year on year, then the cumulative benefit is far in excess of that figure. So when you're talking about a benefit to health or the environment, is it assumed there's a kind of time scale that's perhaps a 10-year horizon for that figure to represent?
So yes, when we do social value analysis and cost benefit analysis, the ultimate indicator we're interested in is something called the net present value calculation. So the net is in reference to benefits net of costs. So what are the overall kind of additional benefits to society, and the present value term there is in reference to understanding all of the benefits across the legacy and the life of the project, and discounting those to present terms. So understanding that there are benefits in 10-20 years time, but they're worth less now because there's some risk that those benefits might not happen, and also that people generally like to have benefits or outcomes occurring now rather than in the future. So when we think about that kind of net present value equation, as it were, the next immediate question is just how far do we go into the future? Typically, unless it's a very large impact in the future, through the discounting, the year-on-year discounting that we apply to future benefits, stuff in 30-40 years time really has quite a marginal impact now. So it doesn't really show up in the social value calculations too much. It's more of the immediate impacts that are having an effect. And one area that I'd like to touch on as well, that we haven't touched on during this webinar, is an issue known as non-use value, and this kind of touches on that kind of question, John, around just how far do we go. So one of the concepts we've started to introduce in the UK with the government here when they're evaluating their infrastructure projects is to think about non-users. So let's take something like a bit of infrastructure that develops around it some public and green space as part of the project. So there are obviously immediate users and benefits of that green space, but there may also be what we call non-users. So these are people that appreciate the fact that other people can use that green space even though they don't use it themselves. So that's kind of like an altruistic benefit, and we want to try and capture that in our social value calculations. But also there's a benefit in the future, which is actually I might appreciate the fact that people in the future can use that green space, generations in the future, even though I don't use it now and I won't use it in the future, and those people will be there using that infrastructure when I'm not alive anymore. So this is known as kind of a bequest value, and we should be trying to include that into the analysis as well. But again, through the discounting, that will become quite small. But we've seen these issues around non-use value, this kind of altruistic value and bequest value, really starting to have an impact on some of the large-scale projects we're doing within government at the moment, and having almost the ability to flip the decision from not doing something to actually doing that policy based on these kind of knock-on or spillover benefits to other people.
Thank you. And Sophie, perhaps I can bring you back in then at this point. And again, a question which has come in about balancing the benefits within a region versus a national level. So you can imagine something is good for the nation, but perhaps not particularly welcomed in the place that it's cited. Is that something that UK GBC has looked at?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, well, the most common real world problem, you kind of cited, I guess, NIMBYism there, but also gentrification. And quite often social value will be focused on the new residents of a particular project, or the people who are the new users of the particular infrastructure, rather than the existing communities. So we know that's a problem. We know it relates to the kind of question we had earlier, which is, how do you define your community or your beneficiaries? Where do you set the boundary? And then within that group, how do you sort of prioritize their needs? I hope it will be something that's, as I said, based on needs. So if it is the case that the needs of a particular group are really being compromised by a particular project, that we prioritize them. Whereas if the need is greater, the needs of that group are perhaps less, get less focused. I mean, that's huge. That's massively oversimplifying a very, very complicated situation. But even beginning to have some kind of guidance on how you would go about defining and prioritizing beneficiaries of value, we think would be a useful exercise, and hopefully something that we're going to include in part of our definition of social value for the built environment sector.
Thank you. I'm sure that'd be very welcome to many of the people listening. A very important piece of work. And I just wonder about procurement regimes, because essentially when you're procuring whatever goods and services you need in delivering a piece of infrastructure, that's going to be involve a lot of people delivering those services and goods. Rather complex supply chains and rather transactional in their nature. How can we have confidence that the procurement chain is going to keep the social value in mind at every stage, or do we just not even try and do that and just make sure there's some mechanism that makes that automatic? How do we deal with procurement? Is that something, Sophia, that UK GBC has thought about?
Yeah, I mean, I think from what we've seen, that actually forcing social value targets and commitments down the supply chain is something that organisations are actually quite good at doing, because ultimately it means that you're relying on the supply chain to deliver for you, which can only be sort of a good thing for you as an organisation. So I think that's the kind of the incentive to do that is there. I think obviously the problem is if those ambitions get watered down or misinterpreted, or again, we keep on coming back to this, falls into sort of a tick boxing exercise, and no one quite knows why they're doing ticking that box, but the orders are there to do it. I think there's also an interesting question around local supply chains and whether they are an inherent part of the social value agenda. If just because a supplier is local, does that mean that it ticks the box of social value? I'm not saying that because I believe I have the answer. I just know that there are strong views on either side. Some say that, and again, it relates to sort of the local need. If you can be addressing a strong social need, but it's not local, should you do that rather than being too pedantic about having to fulfill a local need when actually there isn't one, and you were procuring a workforce from a place that really did need that, really did need those jobs, but somehow you were being forced to provide them locally. That that's sort of not a good result for anyone. So those are the kind of things I think we're going to try and avoid.
Yes, and indeed. I mean, when one looks at the new projects being delivered, part of the sell, if you like, very often is, here's a great new piece of infrastructure and it's going to create local jobs, as if creating non-local jobs is somehow not a benefit, even though of course it might be, certainly in the wider context. Daniel, what would be your observations about the supply chain?
So I think for me, it's a large thing is around incentivization, and that, what I mean by that is making social value a key part of business as usual, and to basically kind of punish organizations or firms that aren't delivering on that through not being able to win further contracts, and incentivizing and rewarding companies that are able to deliver on social value. And we're seeing, I think, over the past couple of years, some movements towards that. So just going back to the Social Value Act issue that you raised a few moments ago, I think with the kind of strengthening of the act a couple of years ago, we've certainly seen local authorities, large procuring bodies, when they are putting out invitations to tender and proposals for large infrastructure projects or maintenance projects, we're seeing increasingly a social value element being evaluated within that, and potential supply chain partners being assessed on the social value that they are forecasting to deliver, how they'll measure that, and how they'll continue to monitor it. And I think in some areas of Birmingham in the UK, we're seeing the weight on that social value element in the evaluation reaching up to kind of 20% of the overall score, which puts it, almost on the same par as kind of budgeting and costs and time and timelines and keeping to timing. So it's getting larger. I think across the UK we are seeing broadly kind of a 10% weighting for social value delivery, but that feels to me the type of correct incentive that we want to apply there, that then incentivizes financially by making it business as usual, and a business success factor for organizations in the supply chain to deliver on social value. So that's a very top-down approach, but I would hope to see also just those organizations that are more socially responsible, more kind of ethically aware, that they would want to be doing this anyway in the supply chain.
Sorry, is it all right if I come in on that point?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
If you look at kind of some of the language around David Lidington's speech, other materials that came out when the Social Value Act was looking at being reinvigorated, so much of the language is around supporting SMEs. So much of the kind of focus of the why they were looking to strengthen the Act was around creating the conditions where SMEs could win contracts. And I think one of the concerns is that actually it might do the opposite, because it's the big organizations who are going to have the resources to be able to respond to measurement frameworks through procurement that tick the boxes, and it's the SMEs who might lose out. So I think that's something we also just need to be cautious of.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So the complexity of the approach could actually itself have a detrimental impact on social value if social value is measured in terms of SME benefiting from opportunities. Let's move on to our final topic. Just very briefly, just want to touch, because this is our ICS, and want to touch on the question of valuation, because obviously investors will be looking at the financial value of a project to determine its commercial viability. So they're wanting to see that return. The returns in terms of social value perhaps are not going to produce a cash return on the investment. So how do we square this? Are there lessons in here for what valuers should be doing to ensure that they're somehow capturing social value in ways that will appeal to the financial investors? It's a rather broad question, but I wonder, Daniel, whether you've had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things here. If we look at an area within government that has been increasingly popular over the last, I think, 3 or 4 years, is the issue around social impact bonds, where you would have a non-government body delivering social impact. It could be, for example, reduction in crime rates, improved educational outcomes for a cohort at a poorly performing school, for example. And you would identify within that what they call a commissioner who would be willing to pay for those outcomes. So let's say the reduction in crime rates leads to knock-on impacts on businesses and reduced policing costs and other types of government expenditure costs. Then there may be, you know, whoever's benefiting from that at a government level may be willing to pay a certain amount back to the organization that's delivering those outcomes. So that's the core kind of I guess framework around social impact bonds, and it might be something similar here. So if you're delivering some infrastructure which happens, you know, through a spillover effect to improve mobility, for example, because you've got more cycle paths or sidewalks and that type of thing, there will ultimately be a knock-on impact on the sector, because you've got NHS cost savings, you've got reduced prescriptions, you've got people who may have lost weight or become more healthy. And there may be a knock-on impact and someone that's willing to pay for that. So looking for that commissioner in kind of a social impact bond type of sense might be one way to go. So, you know, thinking through whether there's a case for developing a social impact bond market within infrastructure that is, you know, where the projects are so large that they have, you know, the potential to really impact in cashable ways as well for the government. And I think the other area is just that, you know, as we start to see the kind of the Social Value Act principles starting to tighten a little bit, and going back to what I was mentioning earlier around more and more local authorities and procuring bodies having you know, a certain percentage of the award criteria based on social value delivery, we will get to a point where no matter how good the financial value looks to be of a particular project, it just won't get through if it's not delivering on social value. So there's an incentive there for surveyors and like-minded people to really start to incorporate other types of wider value when they think about social value, because, you know, financially you're going to be at a kind of a go or a no-go phase at some point, where you're, you know, despite how much economic or financial value a particular project is generating, it's not going to get chosen because it's poorly performing on the social value element. So I think naturally the market may persuade people to start to look at value in a more holistic sense when they are valuing, you know, these types of assets.
And indeed, the more we can build up evidence that social value is delivered, the more you have a basis for the valuations to look back at that evidence and to point to an increased return value as a result. Sophia, from your point of view, financing of projects and social value, what's the interplay there for UKGBC?
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking of sort of the macro level, I think that it's clear from the way that we're talking about value as a global society is changing. There is a wider understanding of value that is needed to sort of, you know, deal with our current context. Thinking specifically about buildings or infrastructure projects and the funding that's out there for them, I think impact investing is a really interesting area, and at the moment impact investing for real estate is quite often focused on the asset class rather than sort of the actual societal benefit, which is a real shame. So it might be that you have a fund which looks particularly at providing social housing or hospitals, but I think that is changing. People are wanting to sort of understand real social value for those specialist funds. So I guess those are going to be the ones who are going to be spearheading what that actually looks like. Is it a single financial figure that represents the social value of a particular project? And to your point, what does that mean? How do we baseline it? We don't have enough data to be able to compare it to other projects. So how do we make that meaningful? And then even more importantly, how do we ensure the rules are being followed? That the actual approach taken in terms of all the things that Daniel mentioned, additionality, other conflicts, particularly around, has it actually responded to a local need? Have those all been followed? And therefore, is it a true and representative number for us to be interpreting when making investment decisions or looking at commercial viability?
Thank you. That's some really good points there. So I'm just going to ask one sort of last follow-up question. Firstly to you, Sophie, and then to Daniel, just to try and capture that, and also to capture some of the points that are coming in from the audience that I haven't been able to squeeze into the hour. Where's the ownership of those data relating to the issues we've been discussing? Who should be trusted to hold all those data and statistics in a way that's consistent and reliable and transparent to allow for benchmarking in a reliable way? How can we go about that?
Gosh, I think that's a really good question. I mean, one thing I know, it's not us. It's something quite often that people come to UKGBC and say, are you able to be those people in the market who keep that guardians of that data and provide baselines? I mean, it's probably more appropriate, for the RICS or someone like the BRE to be to have that kind of perspective on it, and to provide that part of the jigsaw puzzle.
Thank you. And Daniel, to put you on the spot with that question very briefly, custodianship, where should it lie?
Well, yeah, I think it should be with an independent body somewhere, and whether government can be involved in that in some form. There are other areas where government will hold vast amounts of data on effectiveness and baselines and things like that in other policy areas. But if you look at, I think, health, where this is most active, so health assessments of different treatments and different types of medical facilities and equipment, you've got lots of kind of live reviewing organizations there. The Cochrane review is a big one where they will be typically looking at all of the different trials that have happened in health and where which ones are more effective, and kind of housing and documenting that in a library. So that's taken a number of decades to develop in health. I think we could probably do it quicker in infrastructure, but it needs that type of body like the Cochrane review. There's also, I think, the Campbell review as well that do a similar thing. So there is precedent that we can follow, but I think it would require some kind of public involvement as well to have that independence.
Thank you. And that's probably about all we've got time for. I'll just reflect a couple of comments online. David Chappell's just pointing out that an independent body is going to have a real challenge in reviewing every project, and I'm sure that's true. The question is then how do we address it? And I just want to note Rowan Griffin and Liz Chain, who've both said a very big thank you to our experts, as has Graham Bussell. So we're getting lots of thank yous and well dones for your comments today. So really informative session, and definitely appreciated by those who've joined us. Well, that is all we've got time for. So many thanks to our guests, Sophia Cox, Sustainability Advisor at the UK Green Building Council, and Dr. Daniel Fujiwara, Chief Executive Officer at Symmetrica Jacobs. A reminder that we'll be publishing a recording and a written summary of this webinar online. Do please feel free to share those with your professional networks when they're available. Please take a few moments to let us know what you thought of today's session by completing the online poll, and that will appear on your screens at the end of the webinar. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, where you can receive news of upcoming webinars and catch up on any that you may have missed. Please also take a look at our new podcast series, have a listen and tell us what you think about that. And finally, you can download the WBEF app from the App Store or from Google Play. Thank you again for joining us and for sharing your questions and comments with us online, and for investing an hour of your valuable time with us today. Until next time, goodbye.